Good morning, I'm Taylor Wilson, and today is Tuesday, September 2nd, 2025. This is USA Today's The Excerpt. Today, what to expect as lawmakers get back to work, plus former CDC directors say RFK Jr.'s actions should alarm every American, and are Vanity license plates protected as free speech? Lawmakers returned to Congress this week after an August recess. I spoke with USA Today's Zach Shermley for a look at some of the looming issues on the horizon. Zach, thanks for hopping on.
Sure thing, Taylor.
So before we get to this coming fall, it's been a busy year for lawmakers so far already. What have we seen among some of the bigger headline-grabbing actions from Capitol Hill?
Right. Well, I think the biggest headline is the fact that Congress passed some of the most significant legislation in recent years in the form of the so-called One Big Beautiful Bill Act. Some people call it OB3, some people call it the BBB. We can just call it a massive domestic policy law or a tax and spending law for our purposes. But this is arguably the most significant accomplishment of either of Donald Trump's presidencies, and it was championed by the White House from the beginning. This is a piece of legislation that's going to reshape social safety net programs, aspects of the American education system, and the healthcare systems as well. It took quite a while and some strong arming by the White House and Senate leadership, especially to try and get certain Republican members, the more moderate ones, on board. But ultimately, President Trump signed that piece of legislation into law on the 4th of July, right before lawmakers went into their August recess.
Well, the first challenge, Zach, on return from recess appears to be about avoiding a government shutdown. This is back in the news. What's the timeline look like to pull this off, and what challenges remain?
Right, we're back in another news cycle of talking about a looming shutdown. And this one is a little bit different from these conversations that we were having back in March, which was sort of the last time that Congress was in a position of trying to get a funding extension known around the Beltway as a continuing resolution through in order to keep the federal government's lights on. But Republicans and Democrats have to come together in some way by September 30th in order to get through the appropriations process and pass a budget for the next fiscal year. There's a big problem with that right now, though, which is the fact that the White House has asked Congress in many cases, and in some instances actually moved forward entirely on its own, with rescinding congressionally appropriated funding, particularly for things like foreign aid. And that has rankled not only Democrats on the Hill, but also Republicans, including the Republican chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, Susan Collins of Maine. And that certainly will complicate any sort of effort to come together before September 30th to agree on a budget.
Well, shifting gears, controversy around the late Jeffrey Epstein kind of took over some of the summer news cycle. Zach, how might this land in Congress, and why is it creating a wedge in some ways between Republicans and the White House?
I would argue, Taylor, that this is interestingly probably the biggest example of congressional Republicans deciding that it's politically feasible for them to disagree with the White House on a big issue. Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, Republican from Louisiana, is really walking a fine line between trying to assuage the Trump administration and the White House and quelling frustration among folks in his caucus who want to see more transparency in the Trump Justice Department's review of the Epstein files. I think this is going to be something that we continue to talk about over the course of the next few weeks and months, and could create more rifts between folks on the Hill and Donald Trump. The House Oversight Committee has received now thousands of pages of Epstein-related documents, and it's poring over them, according to the Republican chair of that committee. So, we'll see how congressional Republicans handle this issue going forward and balance it and the concern over the Epstein files from their base and the broader MAGA voting base with Donald Trump's personal feelings about this matter.
All right, USA Today's Zach Shermley. I appreciate the insight as always, sir.
Thanks, Taylor.
China's President Xi Jinping brought his Russian and North Korean counterparts together for the first time earlier today. Russian leader Vladimir Putin said there are unprecedentedly high relations with China and thanked his dear friend Xi for the warm welcome. Analysts will be watching this week to see if the trio may signal closer defense relations after a pact signed by Russia and North Korea last year and a similar alliance between China and North Korea. Their meetings come ahead of a massive military parade in China tomorrow, where Iran's leader is also set to attend. All of this comes at a time when President Trump's isolationist policies strain some of Washington's alliances. And in his comments, Xi told a gathering of more than 20 leaders of non-Western countries, quote, "We must continue to take a clear stand against hegemonism and power politics." 9 former leaders of the CDC are warning that every American should be alarmed at what's happening to the nation's public health system under Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. In an opinion piece published in the New York Times yesterday, the former directors wrote that what Kennedy is doing is unlike anything our country has ever experienced. Most recently, Kennedy fired Susan Menarez as CDC director following a dispute over vaccination policy that led to the resignation of other top officials. Kennedy said the agency needs an overhaul. The 9 former CDC directors speaking out, though, wrote their concern not just about that firing, but also about Kennedy's dismissal of thousands of other federal health workers, his approach to the recent measles outbreak, his choices for federal health panels, and his support for federal legislation that's expected to reduce the number of people on Medicaid. Are vanity plates protected as free speech? The nation's highest court may decide. I spoke with USA Today Supreme Court correspondent Maureen Groppi for more. As always, thanks for joining me, Maureen.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
All right, so what is that issue here over license plates, and who's bringing this to the high court?
The issue is whether a vanity license plate, that's one in which the driver is choosing the letters and numbers on the plate, whether that is legally considered personal speech or is that government speech for the purposes of the First Amendment. If it's personal speech, for example, that limits a state's ability to control what people can put on those plates. This case involves a woman from Tennessee. She was issued a vanity plate and she used it for 11 years. But after receiving a complaint about the plate, the state revoked it. The letters and numbers on the plate were 69 PWNDU. The letters reference Ponju, an onliner gamer phrase meaning to beat an opponent. And the woman gave 2 different explanations for the number 69. She said on her initial application that it reflected her phone number. She later said she's an astronomy buff, and 69 refers to the year of the moon landing. But the state revoked the plate because they said the numbers have a sexual connotation.
All right, well, what have the lower court said, either in Tennessee or elsewhere, Maureen?
Well, Tennessee's top court, the Tennessee Supreme Court, said the state could revoke the plate. But that court acknowledged that other judges around the country that have considered similar cases have ruled the other way.
And Maureen, I know the U.S. Supreme Court justices weighed in here as well, right, back in 2015. What did they decide then?
That case in 2015 involved specialty license plates. Those are plates that support a cause or an organization, and they might say, for example, choose life or conserve water. That case specifically involved a request for a plate with a Confederate flag on it. And in a 5-4 decision, the court said states can prohibit images like the Confederate flag because the plates convey a government message. But a state's control over the design of the plates is potentially a different issue than the personalized numbers and letters that people request to put on them. So if you see a license plate that reads, "I am high" or "I'm a brat," do you think that's reflecting the views of the state, or is it reflecting the views of the driver?
All right, so we're talking about vanity plates here, but Maureen, really, what's some of the broader import of this case beyond license plates?
Well, one expert I talked to said if the Supreme Court does decide to take up this issue, it may be because the justices want to weigh in more broadly on what constitutes government speech. That's an issue, for example, in challenges to books that are being removed from libraries. So is it government speech when the library decides which books to put on its shelves? If it is, then there aren't the same First Amendment protections.
All right. Maureen Grappi covers the Supreme Court for USA Today. Thank you, Maureen.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to The Excerpt. You can get the podcast wherever you get your audio. And as always, you can email us at podcasts@usatoday.com. I'm Taylor Wilson. I'll be back tomorrow with more of The Excerpt from USA Today.